Hello everybody and welcome back to another exciting edition of Boyographic, the show in which I, Matt, the Game Boy, take you through the highs and lows of the Game Boy library one cart at a time. This week we will be looking at an odd one. It's Shaq Fu. After 80 episodes of Boyographic, I think it's quite clear that the Nintendo Game Boy is perfectly capable of delivering some pretty breathtaking gaming experiences. We've seen platformers, puzzle titles, and RPGs on Nintendo's little handheld that could, but one thing I've purposely not covered are fighting games. As a 2-button system full of 16-bit conversions, the Game Boy has long been dragged through the mud over its inability to capture the arcade experience on a small screen. However, taking a leaf out of my good friend Jeeb's book, I decided to delve into the system's fighting games archive to see if this was true across the board. Naturally, comparing versions of Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat, or any of the SNK titles seemed a little bit unfair on the Game Boy. So I looked at the system's library, and there, shining like a beacon, was a perfect benchmark. A game generally regarded as terrible on the systems it was built for, namely Shaq Fu. Yes, folks, in the early 1990s, basketball was the thing. Eager to line their pockets the same way most clothing brands seem to with their team hats, jerseys and starter jackets, EA began to develop as many basketball-themed games as they could. I'm not just talking regular NBA and spin-offs either. I'm talking games like Michael Jordan, Chaos in the Windy City, and of course, the infamous Shaq Fu. You see, at the time, Shaquille O'Neal was incredibly big. At 7'1" and weighing in 147 pounds, his height and sheer physicality made him arguably the greatest centre the game has ever seen. Combine this with a lively personality and a ton of media appearances, and it's easy to see why Shaq, just like Michael Jordan, seemed set to become as big a celebrity off the court as on it. He starred in Hollywood movies, Pepsi commercials, and even had several rap albums, the second of which was called Shaq Fu, The Return. This would be the catalyst for someone at EA to say, hey, let's publish a fighting game with Shaq. Not being the publishing giant they are today, they couldn't reach out to a Midway or a Capcom to create a fighting game made by those in the know. Nope, their developer of choice for this infamous game was Delphin Software, the studio responsible for one of my favourite games of all time, Another World. Well, the game's animation and music are generally pretty well regarded, as you'd expect with the studio's heritage. The fighting on offer has led some to call it the worst fighting game of all time, with the game's biggest complaints being its story, incredibly unfair computer AI, and more importantly, seemingly huge input lag. If you're looking for a great video analysing the console versions of Shaq Fu's biggest faux pas, then you should really check out Cora Gaming's video on the title as well. The man can speak to fighting games with more authority than I can. Now, on to the main event. I can quite happily say from the off after a lengthy preamble that in my eyes, Shaq Fu for the Game Boy is the best version of the game out there. Hardly the highest praise, I know, especially considering the Game Boy game has a ton of issues. But bear with me and I'll explain my reasoning. In my experience of Game Boy fighting game ports, in order to keep the core gameplay intact, developers tend to sacrifice the game's visuals and frame rate. Unexpected development, however, managed to keep both of them in Shaq Fu. How might you ask? By trimming the fat. Gone is the game's story. Bam! No more Shaq in Japan. Gone are the unnecessary overworld maps between fights and good bloody riddance to tournament mode. Instead, what unexpected development focus on in their Game Boy port is minimalising the apparent problems with the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive versions by focusing on the game's combat. Moves by necessity on the system have less input lag as the characters don't need the extra frames of animation to get into their fireball pose, for example. A simple forward, back, forward punch will see Shaq throw a fireball instantly, meaning the AI has no time to dodge it, unlike the telegraph projectiles on the console version. But, of course, with 2 buttons comes bigger issues. A lot of the moves in Shaq Fu's console version focus around a 6-button layout. Fast punch and kick are generally mapped to A and B respectively on the Game Boy. What's not so obvious is that power kicks and punches, the game's heavy punch and kick equivalents, are done by pushing back and the corresponding fast button, which admittedly feels rather awkward. Fortunately, Shaq's movesets don't require you to implement a power kick after, say, a half or quarter circle on the D-pad, like Memphis's Fire Arc or Kaori's Cyclone, which I, for the life of me, cannot actually pull off on a Game Boy. Hoping to find the movesets for each character in the game's manual proved fruitless, even after managing to track down some scans thanks to the incredibly helpful RPG Collector on Nintendo Age. But what seeing scans in the manual did alert me to, however, was a very interesting discovery. By plugging Shaq Fu into a Super Game Boy, a 2-player mode becomes available. Yes, that's right, you can play this game 2-player on a Super Nintendo with proper controllers, which, as you might expect, is easier than using the handheld itself. It should be a mark against the game, but as it's such a low bar to jump over anyway, I can only see this inclusion as a bonus. The game does also feature a duel mode in which you can select any of the game's 6 characters to play a quick 2-round game as, but the only real reason to play Shaq Fu alone on a Game Boy is its arcade mode. You play naturally as Shaq, battling through the game's 5 fighters for seemingly the same reasons as on the console game, just without any of that flavour. While the great portraits of the fighters remain in this port, gone is the text informing the player of what's going on. I would say it's a downside, but again, as the console's version's story is drivel, in the long run, it's probably a good choice. While the game unfortunately still has health bars that drain from the centre of the screen, due to the size limitations of the Nintendo Game Boy, this version includes an incredibly simplified version of the countdown clock found in the console versions, which is a godsend. But the most impressive thing about this game is, as I hope you'll have already noticed, is how smooth the animation is. Shaq jumps, roundhouses, and fireballs incredibly sleekly, as do the rest of the characters, all the while maintaining the game's speed with very little tearing. I must say though, I was surprised at how playable this game was. I played various versions of the home console game, and I rarely get past Kaori because I find Shaq Fu incredibly frustrating. But on the Game Boy, well, I've beaten the game at least 5 times since I got it, as it's actually quite fun to play. While I did originally start the game on its easiest difficulty, I've since found myself playing it on hard. It's challenging, but not impossible, which is a refreshing change from the SNES version where, even on easy, I get owned by the cat lady every time. With crisp animation, decent tunes, and the big addition of a 2-player mode, Shaq Fu is a curious glimpse of what a good version of that game could have looked like on a Super Nintendo, but doesn't quite get to the level where I'd be comfortable calling it a great game. Fun in small doses, sure. I'd even go so far as to call it good. But some things cannot be so easily overlooked. The lack of buttons on the system is a limitation that many will come across and rise above, but I do think the use of a diagonal and a button for a heavy is a bit of a cheap move on the part of the developer. Fortunately though, if you're really struggling, you can always just hold down and kick to clear the game with relative ease, which is a bit of a cheap exploit. What isn't cheap, however, is actually finding a copy of this game. Seriously, as a non-US collector, it took me over 3 years to find a copy of Shaq Fu at a reasonable price. Maybe the liberation of portable Shaq Fu carts by ShaqFu.com was a success, but I honestly think that this game is rare because the console game failed to set the world on fire, and as a result, not many Game Boy ports made it to store shelves. Maybe one day soon, someone will find a whole warehouse full of sealed copies of Shaq Fu. But until then, I'd say give it a miss. For such a high-priced game, there are literally hundreds of other great games you should be buying instead. While it might be the best version of this game around, let's not forget the important thing here, and that is, at the end of the day, it's still Shaq Fu. And that brings us to the end of another Boyographic, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed. If you liked this video, please check out some more about Boyographic videos if you haven't already, and please share the channel with people you think may be interested in it. Until next week, you can find me on Twitter at Gameboy and on Facebook and Instagram at the same place. Until then, be sure to leave a like and comment, and game on.